Bonsoir et bienvenue à tous. Nous sommes ravis que vous soyez parmi nous ce soir, que ce soit physiquement ou en ligne. My name is Laurie Schubert. I'm the Executive Director of the Quebec Writers Federation. You may not know that tonight's event marks the opening of the Quebec Writers Federation's Writing Matters campaign, which you'll hear more about from our host in just a moment. But first, I want to say that the Quebec Writers Federation represents diverse individuals who live and create on traditional territories of many First Peoples. The QWF office, right across the hall, is located in Jojage, which is what Kanyangahaga, Mohawk, and now many others call Montreal. This place has been and continues to be a historical gathering place for many Indigenous peoples. We're grateful to be part of a long and proud history of creating and sharing stories on these lands. Now, please welcome tonight's host and the QWF treasurer, who is at the helm of the Writing Matters project, Don McDonald.
Hi, everybody. Great turnout for what I think is going to be a fascinating evening of discussion on AI and the future of writing. As Laurie mentioned, this is the launch event for the Writing Matters campaign to mark the QWF's 25th anniversary. The goal of the campaign is to highlight the value of professional writing, to recognize and celebrate writers, and to encourage those who hire writers to pay them and treat them fairly. Besides tonight's event, we're also organizing a series of pop-up booths that we're calling The Writer is In. The idea is that the public can get a professional writer at one of these booths to help them with a writing problem they might have. Could be a delicate note that they have to send to a friend, or an application, or who knows, even a love letter. It's modeled after Lucy's The Doctor's In the Peanuts comic strip, and we think it's going to be a lot of fun. Besides that, the first of those pop-up booths, The Writers In, will be at the Westmount Library on October the 14th. So, and then there'll be other events around town, so look out for those. We also have a social media campaign planned, and also we're doing, the QWF's gala on November 13th will be under the theme of Hats Off to the QWF, 25 years of Writing Matters. So all this also dovetails with a revamped Hire a Writer directory, which is a great resource that the QWF has been working on very hard. It's another project that dovetails with our campaign. And there, writers who want to offer their services can offer them to people who are looking for writers, editors, and coaches for their writing projects. So that's this. In the back, you'll find these cards. This is for the Quebec the Writing Matters, and also for Hire a Writer. So they have QR codes, and you can find websites there that will give you more information. Now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. Starting with Crystal Chan. Crystal is the Vice President of the QWF. As both a writer and a digital designer, her specialty is merging storytelling and technology. Crystal is a professor in the Creative Writing Department of the University of British Columbia and an editor at UBC for Raven Space Publishing, an innovative program for Indigenous authors. In 2022 and 23, she was an artist in residence at the Banff Center in Computational Writing, exhibited algorithmically generated literature at BAM Gallery, and taught AI writing to undergraduate students. Her latest new media production is CBC Stitch Media's 80,000 Steps. Sean Michaels is the author of Do You Remember Being Born, a novel of AI and poetry, as well as the books Us Conductors and The Wagers. His nonfiction has appeared in The Guardian, McSweeney's, Pitchfork, and The New Yorker. Sean is a recipient of the Scotia Giller Prize, the QWF Paragraph Hugh McClellan Prize, the Grand Prix Numix, and the Prix Nouvelle Écriture. Andrew Piper is professor and William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at McGill University. He uses the tools of data science and AI to study human storytelling. He's the author of the he's the director of the Text Lab, where the aim is to use AI and NLP to better understand human storytelling. Andrew is also the author of the book Enumerations, Data, and Literary Study. And our moderator is Julian Sher. Julian is an award-winning investigative journalist, a veteran TV documentary writer and director, as well as an accomplished newsroom trainer and the author of 7 books, including The North Star, Canada, and the Civil War Plots Against Lincoln. And with that, Julian, it's all yours.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Don, and welcome everyone and everybody. We have apparently more than 100 people watching us on Zoom. The advent of artificial intelligence has brought about transformative changes among many industries, and the realm of writing is no exception. While AI offers unprecedented opportunities for efficiency and creativity, it also can cast a looming shadow over both fiction and nonfiction writers. AI models can now produce coherent storylines, develop characters, and even emulate the writing styles of renowned authors. This poses a unique threat to fiction writers who depend on their imaginative prowess to craft compelling tales. AI also poses challenges to the job market for writers. As business and publications turn to AI-generated content for cost effectiveness, writers may find fewer opportunities to showcase their talents. However, amidst these threats, there are silver linings. As the boundaries between human and machine-created contents blur, writers must adapt, embracing AI as a supportive tool rather than an adversary. I hope you found my presentation scintillating, but in all honesty, I have to admit, I did not write that introduction. That introduction, word for word, was written by AI. I asked ChatGPT to write an introduction for a panel on AI, and it goes on, and it's pretty good, actually. Now, I also asked it if I would be a good moderator for a QWF event, and it said, having a respected investigative journalist like Julian Sher as a speaker could attract a diverse audience. Sher has honed his skills in storytelling. His involvement would align with the goals of the Quebec Writers Federation in fostering a love for reading, writing, and critical thinking. So depending what you think of me, you can think that AI is either bad or good. Now, all that is really just a taste of what we're going to hear tonight, and I'm going to do a lot less of the talking. These 3 excellent panelists, who are all practitioners in both writing and AI, will thrill you. We'll go till about 8 o'clock for about an hour, and then we'll have at least a half hour for questions from you and from our online audience, and then of course we'll have wine and cheese. Let's start with all of you, but we can start with you, Andrew, let's get a definition of what is AI. What is artificial intelligence?
Technology.
The battery's not working? Or maybe this one.
Yeah, I'll try this one until we get this one figured out. There you go. Hi, everybody. I figured out the technology. Yeah, we were thinking it might be useful before we get started. So I'm gonna wear my professor hat just to define this concept, because it can be used in a lot of different contexts. It can mean a lot of different things. And just so we have a sort of working knowledge of what we might mean by AI, especially in this context. So mostly what we'll be talking about, I think, is AI as generative AI. So when we use the term generative AI, we're usually talking about things that are called large language models. And large language models are AI systems that have been trained on a lot of data, usually from the internet, but a lot of other places that we're starting to learn more and more about, that produces language based on prompts. So based on the question you might ask it, given that context, it'll say things based on what it's learned. And it has a very, what we call large parameter space. These are things that tell us that it is large, that it has learned a lot about human language production. And the surprising thing about them that caught everyone off guard was that this sort of memorization of large amounts of human writing turned out that it could produce very sensible human sounding language. And that was the big flip once we had things like ChatGPT that really shifted the landscape. But it's important just to keep in mind that the history of this is very, there's nothing new about this in some sense. It's just the power that is new. So autocomplete on your phone or spell check in your Microsoft Word, these were sort of very early AI systems or language models, right? And AI also gets used in lots of other contexts. So things like, assisting radiologists in detecting cancer and imagery, or helping robots do things in warehouses, self-driving cars, right, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of different contexts. And so it's important that this is one dimension when we talk about AI as a writing tool. We're talking about a generative AI system that is a language model built off of documents that we've all written and read and things like that. So that's it for, getting started.
There we go. A lot of scaremongering and hype, and without being Chicken Little and the sky is following, much less Skynet and Terminator, and the robots are going to attack us. Let's start first with some surprising insight, especially from our authors, but also from Andrew, about what, for both of you, are some of the benefits of AI. And let's start with you, Sean. And Sean might be too shy to promote his book, but I will. If you can talk about writing and writing this book.
Sure. So, yeah, well, so 4 years ago, about 4 years ago, in 2019, I strayed over onto some strange little corner of the internet to a website called Talk to Transformer, a very badly named site, but from a coder in Toronto. And what he had done is he had gotten access to kind of the researcher backend, whatever, access to an earlier version of something of the technology that kind of underlies ChatGPT. So OpenAI is a company that makes this now very popular AI large language model, made ChatGPT. ChatGPT uses version 3.5 of GPT. Version 3 came before that, and version 2, GPT-2, came before that. So in 2019, GPT-2 had been released, but really was only engineers, coders, academics, people in the AI space that were kind of playing with it. But this guy with Talk to Transformer had built this little website where anyone could go there and see what is now pretty familiar to many of us, a little text box where you could type in anything you wanted, and the system would then finish your sentence, would then continue what you had written. And I just stumbled onto this space and I started writing some things, and I found myself deeply disquieted, unsettled, and also at times a little bit delighted by what it was feeding back to me. I could obviously just say, I had a dream last night, and then, I had a dream last night in it, comma, and then I would ask it to complete, and it would dream up some weird dream. But I could also take a chunk of some fiction I had written. I'm a fiction writer, part of a short story or a novel, feed that in. And I found that it had a kind of unsettlingly good, not great, but unsettlingly good grasp of aspects of my writing style, just like this. And what was really sort of spookiest about it is I felt like, 2, 3, 4 years ago, I'd played with different kinds of computer writing. And I mean, 2, 3, 4 years before 2019, and it couldn't at all. It was garbage. It was not. And so suddenly it was like this real switch had flipped. And here was something on a little webpage on the internet that seemed to be able to write. And I found it very curious. And I decided to write a novel about a poet, a 75-year-old poet at the height of her powers, who agrees to go to California and in exchange for a very large check, write a poem with this Silicon Valley company's new poetry AI. And the book, in my imagining, would take place in the near future. And it's about this poet called Marion, and she encounters an AI called Charlotte, and they spend a week writing a poem together. So I wrote the book. The book came out a couple of weeks ago. And whereas when I first started drafting this book, it took place, as I say, in the near future, I thought that maybe there'd be a page at the beginning that said, 5 years from now, or a few years from now. Then it became 1 year from now in the edits. And then by the time the book was published, we decided, let's just drop that page, because by the time it's published, it might mean like last week. So things have moved very, very fast. And I guess what I want to just say at this juncture is, I think we're all here because we're unsettled, afraid, maybe also delighted. But the thing as a writer, I want to ask all of these questions in my book. What does this mean for art? Does it undo us? Are there possibilities for redemption? Are there possibilities for increasing the expanse of what it is to be an artist? And the image that I kept thinking about lately is in the kind of positive, if we're starting off in a kind of positive space, is if someone had told me that there was, in a grove on Mount Royal, in a forest somewhere, you could walk, if you knew the right place to look, you walk till you see the daffodils, turn right at the daffodils, follow this little trail down, there's a little brook that's babbling, maybe you'll see a little rabbit sniffing at the clover. And over there's like a rock, a big weird rock. And it's not a scary rock, it's just a big weird old rock covered in lichen. And if you put your hand on it and close your eyes and murmur a sentence, it will then, say a sentence back. I mean, most of us, I think, would be delighted by this. We would find it exciting and strange and mystical and weird. And we might not be using it to write our books. We might not be firing our textbook writers and our teachers and replacing them with this rock, but there's a certain magic there. And for me, as an artist, I believe that artists are resilient enough and writers are resilient enough to be able to survive the advent of a rock that can mutter a sentence back at you. But I also find that there's something interesting there, something to play with. And throughout the history of time, artists have been playing with new discoveries, from photography to the dictionary to different kinds of colors and pigments. And so I just think that's a part of this conversation that needs to be there too.
In my profession, we'd say Sean also buried the headline, because what's amazing about his book, which it's just terrific and funny, is it's written as well, not only about AI, but with AI, so that all the shaded sections of the book,
actually half, yeah, it's complicated.
We're written, with the help of both AI and a program that he designed. So we can get more into it later, but it's a perfect example of how AI may not be as scary as we think. Crystal, you teach AI, and you also are using it writing. Can you talk about what you're telling the next generation of writers?
In terms of, well, first starting for me as a writer, I love this description that Sean took us through, walking into the woods, finding the mystical rock, Cassandra, whispering voice. But I don't think that's actually what a lot of us experience when we go and see ChatGPT box turn on our computer. So just as a writer and artist myself, I would think the interesting challenge is to add that dash of magic and mysticism again. I don't think it's always there. And so one way that, that happens is we talk a lot, I'm sure we'll talk a lot more today about what exactly AI can do, what it does, what it's good at, what it's bad at. I think we've heard that some things it's good at are being efficient. Andrew explained kind of what it even is. And in essence, it's about predictions, we know, right? And so it goes beyond something like a search engine or Google, because it doesn't just match you with something that is already out there, but instead, still based on what is already out there, it predicts, right? But it's predicting based on existing content. If you turn on the TV to the Weather Channel and you found out that tomorrow would rain because what is tomorrow, Friday? Most Fridays in September in Montreal, it rains. That's not actually helpful, nor is it very cheeky or creative either. So I find that in terms of that mysticism and magic, artists and writers are doing unpredictable and inefficient things with AI. Not most or all, but an example of that is, I'll tell you a little bit about my own introduction to not necessarily algorithms and AI and computational writing. I had already been poking around a little in that, but to ChatGPT. So last year I went, it was mentioned, to Banff, and it was in this cohort of writers doing all kinds of interesting things with new technology. And I'm secret here, that I'll confess is I'm actually very much a Luddite, some would call in real life. Some people in the audience that actually know me will know that I'm horrible at answering my phone because I don't take it anywhere with me. I don't take it into the forest, on my forest rock. And I actually find that's quite common. I don't know if you guys agree among people that work in new media and technology. Anyway, so I was at Banff, really in the forest, and I was the one kind of whirring around saying, what's this? There was at least one or two other writers there and working with ChatGPT, but I had never heard of it. Or I'd heard of it, but I never used it. At that point, it was the put a coin in model where it was still open only to, if you had a login with your institution and things like that. It didn't particularly seem extremely interesting to me. And also the model was not as interesting objectively at that point. But the writer I was working most closely with, their name is Lillian Yvonne Bertram. They're based in the States. And among many other amazing things, they have written books, including a National Book Long Listed Award, a book of poetry made with, in essence, to oversimplify, they made their own version, let's say, of ChatGPT. So we really, they opened a lot of worlds for me in terms of exploring how to do that, and in a case doing something like a DIY ChatGPT, making and tweaking your own language model. Why would you do that? Part of it is that smallness. I think it's kind of like building a bike instead of a Boeing, and that's on purpose. So last year, I was given a task. I was given a commission for a group exhibit. And at that point, I didn't start thinking I was going to use what I had learned at Banff and played around at Banff. But what I was given was a bunch of text already written by somebody else. This exhibit was all about examining monuments in Montreal, so things like statues and public spaces. And there were a group of about 12 different artists, many of them visual, so they had the benefit of translating the text into another medium. And in a way, I was challenged to do that myself. And I thought, ironically, almost to avoid plagiarism rather than the other way around, I took this text I was given. It was written in a kind of like that historical social sciences high school textbook dry, this is fact, and about things like the Freddie Villanova shooting and other very politically charged, Sir Georges Etienne Cartier monument and things like that. So I wanted to actually on purpose kind of question and think about the presentation of voice, how something that uses a historical, this is a factual, accounting of events, gives you the sense that it's truth. And so I built and tweaked and trained a basically small version of ChatGPT to mimic that same historical voice, but scrambled it like fridge poetry, and then curated it. I would say that is probably the most important thing I teach my students as a skill in the future, a future that has AI. And it came up with these just very poignant and sometimes unintentionally truthful phrases. Things like, here, I have one written down. This area known as Quebec to Britain, the result of a heart attack. Very poetic phrases, mishmashes of different political events, but all in that very dry text. And I use that as part of the piece. That was a visual exhibition. But I think it's about playing around with it to see what AI is good at and what it's not good at, and adding a bit of that mysticism.
Andrew, from your studies and what's going on at McGill and your perspective, what do you see as some of the positive applications of AI for writers and also for teaching and education?
Yeah, I tend to sigh a little bit when I talk about this topic, because I'm not quite sure what to say or how to feel about it yet. I think that's one of the biggest things that I often sort of put forth, is the uncertainty behind all of this is really challenging. So, one of the ways I've been impacted is as an educator, as a teacher. So, if you have kids in the university age or cégep or even secondaire, we're already running into the problem of like, what do we do about assignments? What do we do about writing assignments? Can you just hand in your assignment at the push of a button? And the answer is, in many cases, yes. And so it's forcing us to rethink how we do assignments, how we assign writing. But the bigger question behind it is this a tool that replaces skills and so people aren't learning something? Or can it somehow augment and facilitate their learning? And that's where, we just don't know yet, right? The hope is that it can do the latter. The fear is that it's going to do the former, right? It's just going to be a replacement, and kids aren't going to learn those writing skills that they really need to move forward. When I get really optimistic, I like to think of this sort of further down the food chain of education. And we think about kids learning to write, it's really hard, right? And we know some kids really succeed at it, some kids really fail at it. There are a lot of gendered aspects around writing. But I often think, wow, imagine if this thing could really be some kind of like writing assistant, right? A sort of personalized, interactive bot that could help you be a little more creative, could help you figure out how to express your thoughts through writing. That would be very exciting, right? That to me is a really neat opportunity if we could get there. But there's a lot of ifs along the way and risks. So
we'll see in the question period if people have more questions about some of the examples people gave of the positive aspects. But let's turn briefly to what a lot of people are talking about. The heads of many of the AI companies went to Congress asking to be regulated, which if you think about it, that's like the cigarette companies saying, please help us stop cancer, or the oil companies saying, help us fight climate change. So you figure if the Zuckerbergs and the Altmans and the Musks of the world are worried, should we be worried? So let me ask each of you briefly, what is the one or two things that scare you the most about AI? Sean, we can start with you.
A million things scare me about this stuff. But in the context of this conversation, I think the thing I would talk about is I think that AI is going to clearly, like, even generative, let's say writing AI, it's just going to exacerbate some of the gaps and inequalities that are already in society. So it's easy for me to imagine, it doesn't seem very far off, some kind of writing assistant. There's probably 10 startups whose press releases were sent to me all today, doing something like that. But those systems aren't actually going to be, they're not going to be free. They're not the good ones. Who's going to have access to all of these kind of accelerative tools? It's going to be, the elites of this planet. And who is not going to have access? And it's the the 99%, or certainly not, that bottom 25% in the global south, and these people who are already disproportionately the victims of these inequalities. And so I can really see this widening, or if you imagine that you've got all these people who are super, like workers who are extremely productive, creative, capable, super employees because they have access to these things. And then everyone who doesn't have access to these things is left in the dirt. And similarly, what worries me for writing is if you start to have tools that are helpful and lofty and interesting, like this rock I'm talking about, if you've got the successful high-level creative professionals who have these tools to help amplify their already good work, and they're discerning enough to know how to incorporate things. They're, it's sort of like a master violin player who is given a, well, this is actually a bad analogy, but is given an electric violin. No, but I mean, if you're given this like extra piece, but you already have all of your, you're a good writer, you've developed all of your hard skills. I don't personally feel threatened that a robot is, that an AI is going to take my novel writing job, because I'm already, I've already got it relatively figured out some days. But it's the people coming up. The only way that I got to be a confident fiction writer or writer generally is by writing, I don't know, 10,000 pages of crap, of doing, I wrote more than something crazy, like 2,000 or 3,000 articles for The Guardian, the website for the newspaper The Guardian, about music news. But they're terrible art. Like, they're really just like the sort of churn of the internet. It was my job for years, was writing these, little recap music news articles that kept me afloat, but they're not very good. However, doing them over and over again is what gave me all these skills. And if AI starts like taking up all the kind of crappy writing gigs and all the easy stuff, then I'm not sure how we as writers spin up to the more difficult stuff if we don't have those years of cycles and cycles and repetition, or those opportunities of the crummy jobs to help us get by until we're talented enough to do higher level work.
Crystal, what do you see as a threat for both writers and publishers and the industry?
Yeah, well, actually, I think a lot of it has to do with the difference between where publishers and writers are coming from. And those crummy jobs, I think absolutely, it's a fear. I would say that, Sean, the Guardian writing job is maybe not the first that the AI is now capable of replacing, or the crummiest job, but certainly those press releases, right? Two things about that. Absolutely, writers need places to cut their teeth. I think we all, like Sean, probably started with a version of that. It makes me think, though, of my own experience, and I wrote at places like, weeklies, right, or local things. In news, for example, AI has been used for nearly, 10 years, you were saying? And what it was used for is stuff like that, stock news, or, you tell me, but yeah, so things that are, bottom of the barrel or reproducible. And I don't know, maybe just those being replaced is what saves a news outlet from shutting down altogether. Because, for example, some of the weeklies I wrote for are no longer existing at all. So it's not only that the assistant level job got taken away, but the whole thing crashed. I don't think that that's the reason we should praise AI, but it's something to kind of consider. Absolutely, the equity, magnifying what's already out in the world. Andrew, you were talking about how writers also, there's a lot of differences where they're coming from when they're learning even things like gender and other things. Another thing I'll say right now is that for these large language models we're talking about, they of course do come from, if not only the internet, places like that include mainly material text content by, not a representation of everyone. Right. So what they're kind of coming in, coming out, whether it's garbage in or not, is not the whole world. Right. So also what these ChatGPT, et cetera, are good at, let's say, writing, they're good at writing basically what already exists out there. So that's, of course, gendered, among other things. In terms of the publishers, I would say that another thing that we kind of have to be careful but not confusing is that publishers can be really supportive and helpful for writers. They'd certainly know more about things like copyright and other aspects, but they can also be at the other end of a fight as a writer sometimes. And I do think that I'd like to learn more about how that is kind of being magnified with AI.
And from a wider perspective, beyond our industry, can you talk about some of the concerns you have?
Yeah, I mean, I would underscore the concerns about inequality in the sense that the history of technology generally works out into a have and have not kind of a formula. And so we shouldn't expect AI to behave any differently, which is a big concern. I mean, you can think about this very practically. So when we're sort of working with students to use these tools, it can be very hard. We know about the hallucination problem. So it's generative, which means it'll just make stuff up. And how do you know when it's, you've asked it a factual question, how do you know if it's making something up? And engineers are working on making this better, but you need the expertise to know when it's good at something and when it's not. And so it has that sort of feedback loop effect where you have to get to a certain level in order to be able to use this tool effectively. And that already then creates problems because there are certain people who are going to be disadvantaged. They access it in a way where they don't have that expertise, and therefore it's not really going to be as beneficial to them. And then on the other hand, these sort of higher level groups that say, oh yeah, I'm doing 10 times the productivity I used to be able to in whatever field it is. And again, that's just going to do that pulling apart process. The other thing I would sort of add, even kind of, you don't want to get too sci-fi-ish, but the generativity of it might have effects on just the kind of like functioning of these cultural ecosystems. So, thinking about publishing houses, studios, editors, there's sort of a flow of information, right, through these gatekeepers and through these filters. And people can find those filters very frustrating and very exclusive. And I think that's always an issue that all these industries have to work to figure out. But we're already seeing issues where if you can generate really high or decentish quality text, those systems are going to crack, right? It's sort of like, I always liken AI to it's like an algae bloom. And it's going to just really suck out the oxygen in different systems. And we're going to need ways of figuring out how to weed that out, like CAPTCHAs for writing. I mean, it just seems crazy, but we're doing the amount of detection work we have to do to keep these things from blooming and taking over. Lots of platforms have talked about we had to stop allowing users to interact because we were getting flooded with AI generated bad information on Stack Overflow or whatever the platform is. That's a big issue. Right, that's a big issue. Whatever platform you run is how do you not just get kind of these feedback loops to just crack systems and servers and information systems. So that's something at a very, big picture. Well, maybe it won't come to pass, but I do worry about that.
Can I add something? That was making me think there's another set of questions that's more kind of axé sur, that's more focused on art, where there's been a lot of talk of magazines. You started to hear about magazines, especially I think Asimov magazine and some science fiction magazines who've announced these official policies that they are not accepting AI generated submissions. Fine. The thought experiment that I find difficult is not what should we do about shitty AI generated science fiction stories, or the algae bloom of fake recipes and fake I mean, that is a big question, but the more relevant thought experiment is, imagine 5 years from now or 10 years from now, just imagine, it may not happen, but that there is an AI system that, let's say 1 out of 100 times or once a week, this system manages to spit out a really good short story. What if suddenly there's really good, just like we're starting to see images from the image rendering AI that are pretty cool. What happens if there's a good short story? What happens if there's 100 good short stories? How do we actually feel about this notion that, at the New Yorker magazine or Harper's or Zoetrope or any of these, or at a publishing house, that we just say we are human first, we are not publishing those good short stories? when I say how do you feel, I don't mean that everyone will be like maybe what we should feel is, yes, we will say only humans allowed. But I don't know, as a reader, not a writer, I find myself curious about compelling, provocative work, wherever it might be. If you told me that, you know, like a goldfish or a monkey at a typewriter had somehow written a really good short story, or a 2-year-old, you know, I would be very curious for this. And I don't know that I would necessarily, my instinct would be like, no, like no monkey fiction. No, I think I'd be like, let's have lots of monkey fiction, you know, as much as we can get. And so I think that it poses a challenge, a kind of more more like deep philosophical challenge too, which is like, what do we think? What do you think of this idea of good work in the arts? If it's possible, it might not be possible, but good work in the arts from a machine intelligence, does that destabilize our whole idea of humanity and the soul and creativity? Or is there a way to kind of reconcile our ideas of human creativity with that?
Well, you know, it's interesting because there's been a lot of conversation in publishing about how AI is probably better for the readers than the writers. Like, what is the purpose of writing? Is it for the writer? Is it for the reader? Is it for both? I mean, most of us are both those things, right? An example of some of these still now bad and nascent AI writing is, oh yeah, you know, let it give you all the fanfic that you want, or the thing that you want. You know, some people even talk about, oh, I generated bedtime stories for my children that starred them. I was kind of thinking, like, I think your child wants you to tell them stories, not about the story itself. But, you know, does it serve the reader? I mean, this is kind of going, I guess, taking me back to just like college philosophy of like, is the author dead or not? Like, is the text that, but, you know, so people have already talked about this question for a long time in the context of AI. Yeah. Is the interest in the author itself? I would say that that's part of it sometimes, and part of thinking backwards of being a writer, what kinds of, I don't know if you want to call it skill or thing to explore you want to hone in on. One of them is thinking about your presence for at least a certain set of your readers, because that's something that kind of interest in you that you can bring. I mean, I think even the absence of you, I'm not talking about being really good at, I don't know, promoting yourself on Twitter. We all know somebody like Elena Ferrante. Like, the whole point is that we don't know who they are, but the mystique of the author still, I think, stands. Yeah, so I don't know, monkey, typewriter. I think as a writer, maybe a lot of, you know, it might be interesting to read. Absolutely. One last thing I most recently learned about as a writer, thinking about it as as a writer, thinking what they want to read, I guess. Somebody that felt it very hard to approach writing a certain topic. In this case, I forget if it was one of my students. I forget if it was the death of a sister, perhaps, or a family member, something they had failed and been able to kind of broach. And it was kind of using that prompt and questioning that they were interested to provoke their own writing, kind of. Yeah, so that's interesting too.
It'd be interesting to see how long will it be when, you know, the winner of the Giller Prize or the National Book Award will then be revealed. The author will say it was completely written by an AI machine. So this bleeds very well into our final topic in the last 10 minutes before we go to questions, which is, given that AI is with us and it's only going to grow, what can we do about it? Is regulation a part of it? Let's deal with that and some of the solutions. Andrew, let's start with you, because you had brought up in one of our earlier discussions about how you thought AI and other software should be treated like cars, planes, and stoves.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very simple and possibly simplistic view of this issue, which is just use the category of safety. You know, people have proposed this where you shouldn't be allowed to deploy an AI system in a public social setting that is going to impact human lives unless it's been tested for safety protocols. We do this with cars, we do this with trains, we do this with planes. You cannot have technologies that impact human lives without passing. Somebody has defined what safety is, and they've defined the checks that you have to go through, whether you're self-regulated or there's an external agency. Think of the scenario where people are saying, okay, well, I don't like these black box corporate AI systems like OpenAI. It's funnily named OpenAI, and there's nothing open about it. So we want open access AI systems, which sounds great. But what happens if it can do really malicious things, right? It can write really evil things on the internet. It can trick people into donating money to false causes, like who knows what. And one way to look at this is simply to say, you cannot deploy it publicly unless you've passed these tests. And if it can deceive people, if it can negotiate, if it can figure out how to steal their identities by hacking into their email, whatever it is, then you can't just say, oh, here's an open access model that anybody can use, because we don't know what they're going to use it for. So my sort of like what to do about this is very kind of regulatory safety oriented, which is we need as a community to define what are the dangers, and then test whether these tools can do those things. And if they can, they cannot be consumed by the public. So.
I mean, I love what Andrew just said, but also when I think about trying to protect, like what can be done at a governmental level to protect us from the damages that AI could have on the livelihoods of artists, of people, of industries, and all of that, I think about untethering that question from the AI piece. The reason that I am so worried about AI, or one of the reasons I'm so worried about, or we are so worried about AI taking people's jobs and all this kind of thing, is because if you lose your job, like, you're not okay. Most of us are not okay. We need these things to be, we need work to be okay. We live under capitalism, and without our livelihoods, we're not okay. And that not okay without your job thing has nothing to do with AI. That has to do with like the social structure and the economic model that we've chosen for our society. And there are other choices, and there are other ways to look after people. And if we chose as a society, we want to make sure that everyone is always okay, no matter what, no matter their health, no matter their work status, no matter all of these things, then suddenly certain of the AI issues start to kind of fade away. Suddenly, I'm not a writer literally in competition with AI for like earnings and revenue, but I'm a guy who's okay making art, doing maybe stuff that's not art too. And at times, maybe I'm engaging with software, AI systems, to make my work more interesting, to get ideas, or not at all, just like when I'm taking photos and I use I don't have a smartphone, but speaking of Luddites, when I'm taking photos on my phone, which I'm not, when I'm taking photos on my camera and then I import them into my laptop, just as I use the magic wand tool to like automatically improve your photo, just as when I'm doing that, I'm not like, oh no, am I taking away the jobs of the photographers? I would never be hiring a photographer to do this. That's not the level. Like there's no economic thing going on. So I'm free to engage with this AI tool of the magic paintbrush filter thing without like feeling all this angst and apprehension about it. And so I think if you can uncouple those two ideas, some of these questions sort of change their nature.
Especially because you're training the next generation of writers. What kind of protection do you think our industry is going to need from AI?
Well, I think education is the key, but first to kind of connect the two things, regulation and money, just because they were so fascinating bringing them up, because yes, I think we should put seatbelts on us, and that would be to the AI companies and so on. But in the context of writing, I take heart for like taking it following where the money is. If we look at all the things happening right now with Hollywood, I'm thankfully not a lawyer, but one of the legal regulations that's happened from what I heard is, yes, you can have, the AI semi-finished screenplay or actor replicated. Oh, but just if it's artwork that is created with AI, it's not copyrightable. I don't know if some of you guys saw that piece of news. And so once, let's say in the future, that same legal regulation, if it can apply to, let's say, a book publisher, if they can't make money, like if that news outlet or that publisher can use AI to churn out articles faster and just as well, but they can't copyright them, well, then they hit a brick wall of money. So that's an interesting way to think about it too. Regulation, not only safety, about security, very important, but also regulation that relates to money. And as you say, it's making your living. In terms of education, things have just really changed just from one year to the next, how much students know about and care about AI. And because I teach creative writers specifically, I have found it to be a very interesting tool to learn about things in the writing industry and the craft itself. So things like, I don't know, humor or subtext that are still very currently bad. They have we use also tools that are made by and for writers that exist out there. So basically versions of ChatGPT that have to do with plot and story, and then talk about plagiarism and things. I am both scared as well as optimistic about that. I mean, the probably first plagiarism detector that was created and is out there was made by a Toronto creative writing student, actually. So I think the kids are also, more with it as well as more immersed in it. And for us, I think, some of those new skills in the world, Julian was telling me he doesn't remember his wife's phone number anymore. So we all lose muscles we don't flex, right? And that's fine. The important thing is we haven't lost the ability to communicate, like, you with your spouse. And so in this new world, hopefully not, and in this new world, I've been finding with a lot of my students that when we use these sort of AI writing, craft things, questions like the importance of editing and curation, asking and the right questions, and having a more artistic voice, what that means. Like I said earlier, writers are not good at exactly what AI currently is at. And I think we should use it to our advantage. We're not good at being efficient, let's face it. We're not good at being predictable. And I think exactly that are the skills we can lean on to not be obsolete. Sorry, I just saw, I have one comic that I show my students and I love it. It's by Tom Gold. So a D&Q comic graphic novelist. And it's like, this AI, the scientist in their white coat, this AI generator has still not written the novel we've trained it to do, but it did generate a whole bunch of emails to the editor saying, it's almost done. Tomorrow, oh, I lost 3 chapters because, so I think, yeah, exactly.
Before we turn things over to the audience, both here and on Zoom, let me ask you for what advice would you give to people in the audience? Sure, there are undoubtedly some writers, but most of us, all of us, are also readers. We're consumers of news, consumers of books. Short advice that you would want to give to people out there about how to cope with this AI storm that's coming. What should they look for? What do they need to demand? Some tips for them. Andrew?
It's a hard, good last question. I sort of thinking of what I coach my students on is just to really try and think about what in your own life, what about your life might AI be useful for or potentially threatening for? In other words, what are the things that you engage in on a daily basis where you think, oh, this could actually be really helpful, or yeah, I could see if it took away that, I'd be upset about that, and really articulate that, because I think the fantasy space of AI's super capacities or all these things is just really too broad and too untethered from reality. So I think we do ourselves a service to really think as concretely as possible about our own individual experiences and the places where, oh, it would be really nice if I could automate that and get some help on that, versus, yeah, I don't want to lose that. That's super important to me. I want to make sure I can always do that or have that kind of communication. So I think it's just sort of bringing it back to where we are to really help as a society and as a community make decisions and, pester our representatives to say, okay, I want you to work harder at this aspect of AI and get away from some of the broad fear mongering that the self-regulators really want us. They want us worried, so we kind of freeze up. And I kind of want people to say, okay, what's really happening here? I think that's key.
I have two things. The first thing, advice for writers, let's say, to narrow it down a little bit. Keep reading. Like, just reading work is the single best thing you can do. Well, writing is important too, but reading is very, very important to cultivating your eye and your ear for, anyway, I won't go on there. But the other thing is, I think you should be checking out these tools and figuring out where the state of the art is and playing with them and understanding them and thinking about them. And in order to do that, you cannot just be using ChatGPT. We've been talking a lot about ChatGPT because it's the best known service. It's this free chatbot on the internet. Anyone can go there. You can kind of have a dialogue with this bot. OpenAI has made ChatGPT particularly banal. They've tried to make it as boring and banal and as reliable, like to fib as little as possible. And they've also configured it to be a chatbot, like this answer response thing. That is not the only way that these AI tools can work. If you pay OpenAI, you can have access to something called the Playground, where you basically have access to better just autocomplete tools. So in that case, you can write pages and pages or paste in many paragraphs of your text and say, just continue what I'm writing. Those versions of OpenAI's tools with GPT-3 and GPT-4, I don't think anyway, it doesn't matter, are much better at mimicking style. That thing that Crystal was happy about, the reliability or the predictability of AI. In the Playground, you can dial up the temperature of the AI. Temperature basically means predictability. So you can make it more or less predictable, the output it has. And you might find that your reassurance of like, oh, it's not good at making surprising poetry, as I did when I was writing poetry with an AI. Oh, actually, it can do some interesting things in this space. Besides OpenAI, there's also a tool I like. I mean, these are all horrible. Like, I like these things, but I'm also like not. But I think you need to learn about it. I just came across, there's a million of these. I think Pseudowrite is garbage. There's a bunch of the famous ones. I don't like Perplexity, but there's something called, I don't like Notion, but there's one called Leica, a startup called Leica. And Leica as well, you can create a custom trained model. So you can upload up to 100,000 words of your own work. I share, do what you will in terms of, do I want to give this system my stuff? That's up to you. But then it will try to create a bot that is more trained on a given style or a given corpus. And that also becomes really interesting. And so I don't think that we can really be prepared for what, how to defend yourself until you've kind of gone and visited that land.
Yeah, I use Leica with my students, and that's the one I mentioned is actually created by a writer. So you're also giving money to a writer and not, Microsoft. Speaking of which, yeah, so do try it. And if any of these things seem a little bit just either inaccessible or you're too lazy, literally hours ago, this came up when we were talking before. Oh, does Microsoft Word already have an AI? No, I think I saw something. We were having this chat about a week or two ago. And the answer was, oh yeah, I'm wrong. I saw something. It was just the editor. It's not the same thing. A few hours ago today, the universe, aka Microsoft, announced that next week they're rolling out basically ChatGPT within Microsoft Word. I mean, who has tried ChatGPT? Raise your hand. Maybe not all of you. Who has used Microsoft Word, right? Like it's here, and all the good and bad of that. I do think that for me, a lot of it is the same way I feel, which is very complex. I'm sure, like most of you, about a topic like climate change or fossil fuels. It's a lot of like individual, some good and bad, including like maybe that car helps you get faster to your appointment. I don't have a car, but you know what I mean, versus a lot of collective worry and problems. So in terms of that regulation and stuff, like just how you would apply to knowing about and educating yourself about things like climate change, you can approach it here, whatever stance you take. and things we've brought up today, like plagiarism and how to detect it, AI generated text and how to read it or not. These are things that I'm working with my students to learn. So you could also start educating yourself. And I think that training is going to be a big part of it. I've often thought about how, as a last thing, as a teacher, I've been forced to think about how to, for example, change my assignments for the creative writing students or mark the assignments, and how, as an editor, which is my other day job, how we have not been trained with that. But I'm also doing that as an editor. I'm reading submissions. I'm needing to give basically an assignment, let's say, right? So in the publishing industry, we haven't caught up in the same way that professors are forced to. And I'm sure probably some high school teachers like way beyond any of us sitting here today, you know, and thinking about all this. Yeah. So let's learn from them.
Well, we've only touched the surface, but you can see how the three panelists have been thinking a lot about this and have a lot of insights. We have about half an hour for questions. Please keep your questions as short as possible, and we'll also mix in some questions from Zoom. So let's start here. She was the first to put up her hand. You'll get a microphone. And how many questions do we have online? Done? Perfect. Great. You guys have the floor. So we'll start here. I won't be able to remember everybody's order.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting panel. And my first question is did ChatGPT go drinking with Hemingway?
Yes. I'm sure ChatGPT
Okay.
would love to go drinking.
It would love, but is the arc of mortality inscribed in this mechanized sort of generative mechanism of ChatGPT? Does it cry? Can you hold its hand? I mean, ChatGPT and these other tools, however interesting they are, however fascinating, whether they generate some decent writing or not, they're not something that has consciousness. It can't appear. How does it respond to questions about why it chose something? Does it choose good cover art for its writing? And then can it describe why it made the choice?
Well, you have to read Sean's book.
I'm not there
because he has, scenes where the real poet, although obviously she's fictional.
Okay. So my question is who called artificial intelligence artificial? Is the concept of artifice as powerful as the concept of simulation? Should it be simulated intelligence? Because to me, it seems like a simulation.
Is that a good name? Is that a good name? Artificial intelligence? Are we misnaming it? Yes, sir.
I don't think I can answer that. It's a very good question. We do spend a lot of time in our classes talking about, what is intelligence? The joke is intelligence is always the thing that AI can't do. And so we keep moving the bar. I think these are very hard terms to define. And I think that aspect of assistance is probably really one way to think about this, as not as a substitute, not as a simulation, but how might it augment some kind of human process of value? I really like that point about thinking about readers. Does this serve a reader? And that really puts the onus on the job, on the task, as opposed to, was it fake? Was it not fake? Is it artificial? Is it real? Like, I think those debates are slippery. Whereas, did it move me? Did it serve the purpose that it had? So.
Good evening. So I have two things I'm gonna go really quick. I want to talk about. First of all, I'm a lyricist, so my specialty was to do adaptation from French to English or English to French. And unfortunately, I've been doing this for 15 years, and lately, composers, they don't need any more lyricists, because it's going to do it on its own, and it can do it in any languages, and you can ask it to rhyme the words to you. So I find it very difficult for me to be for AI, as it's taking like a lot of jobs away. Another thing I want to go fast into is I would like to have your advice, because I'm finishing my first novel, and before sending it to a publisher, I would need to have my manuscript edited. And how am I going to trust that who's going to edit my manuscript is not going to pass it through AI, and then that's going to be a a huge disadvantage for me, for a publisher that might find that, was it AI that wrote this and I spent 3 years writing it? So I would like to have your advice on this for this next steps for me.
Right now, at least, it's something that AI is really not good at, and by that I mean people have done all these tests and try to trick it and so on, is exactly editing. For example, one part of editing that AI is talked about as being good at possibly doing is the slush piles. It's better at that. So that's when you read all the submissions of novels, right, manuscripts, and it's better at that than, you know, substantive editing, but it's still not very good. And mainly it's not very good because it's good at telling when something is bad in an obvious way. It's not as good, but sometimes can tell if something is good in an obvious way, but it's certainly not good yet at telling something how to make something bad better. So something bad good, which is at least what editors tell themselves they're trying to do.
My question is more like I wasn't gonna run my old book through AI, but what I was asking, it was like, if I hire a company to edit my manuscript before I send it to a publisher, how do I know that they're not using any kind of?
Well, right now you can probably, not only right now, I think forever, you should probably ask them if you're concerned about that. I would assume that you can't just tell people that you're.
I was like, just really, truly, practically speaking, there's nowhere that you can copy and paste in more than 50,000 words. It's just like.
But even if I did it by part, like
if they did it by piece,
they did it by section. So.
You probably should be more discerning about which editor you choose.
So I'll ask you which editor I should.
The Quebec Writers Federation has a lot of, in the hire a writer directory. Yeah.
Oh, yes, sir.
Hello. I will try not to say too much in terms of, I'm a teacher at Dawson. I teach literature. So I'm basically, I don't talk about it ever. I just, because I have pretty strong feelings about AI. My main question is, why are we even bothering? Why don't we just say no? I think we're saying yes to too much coming from Silicon Valley. It's changed our culture completely. Why do we have to keep saying yes? Okay, that's one thing. Two, with my students, young people, writing's hard, damn hard. That's why I'm not a novelist, okay? But I do appreciate literature. I studied it, obviously at a high level. So writing's hard, and hard things are good. Cooking from scratch is hard, knitting's hard, making things with our hands is hard, creating art. Why don't we keep doing hard things? I think we're doing too many things are too simple. We're getting lazy. Why do we just not say no? And I'm sorry, I appreciate what you're doing, but I'm not going to I don't do any assignments at home anymore. Everything's in class. And when they have to try and write a thesis statement, you will see how hard it is. And they'll, oh, I can't do this. That's good work that we're doing with them. And all of us in the English department pretty much are not letting them do any work at home. That's a favor to them. To me, that's being loving, because we're making them do hard work in school. That's all I have to say. I appreciate what you're doing, but I think we also really need to keep out AI out of young people in elementary schools. They need to really learn to read and write. And if they don't, then this is about equity and equality. If we're not letting normal kids learn to read and write, the hard work of learning to read and write. That's yeah.
That was a great point.
Should we say no and can?
Well, the thing that just the question that this, like, as I said, like, I've been trying to chew on these questions, that this worthy thing that you're describing, like, I admire and I love everything you've said. The question it begs for me is students, like I have a 7-year-old at home. Like, I understand that my 7-year-old is going to grow up in a world where people will not have said no. Like, the humanity won't have been this chorus of like 5, 6, 7 billion people saying no and standing up to like a handy trick. Like, if you tell someone that I have a handy trick for how to clean your spinach faster, people start using it. If it's like, oh, you can just buy pre-chopped pre-grated cheese, people will buy pre-grated cheese. You know what I mean? And I think that there's going to be this world like this. And I worry personally that if my son or if our students today are brought up so that they do not experience or think about these things until suddenly they're grown-ups out in the world, then I fear that they're like slipping into a world where they have not reckoned with these while in the period of their lives where we are trying to like shape them and direct them. It's a bit like saying, or yeah, that's what I wonder. How do you prepare kids for a world of AI if you never talk to them about it? Yeah, until adulthood, you know.
I think what I just want to say is that there are students that are coming to us without skills. They can't take notes. I mean, they literally cannot take, they don't take notes. They come from certain schools who thought, especially the private schools, who think they're doing their kids a favor by having them on a tablet from grade 7, sec 1, okay? So I don't think that's a good thing, because we're finding in all of us, I'm in a department of 80 teachers, we just can't believe how they have no skills to take writing. They can't take notes physically. And I say, look, guys, where's the good students who have gone to schools that don't have that iPad or from grade 7, they do. And they're thriving. And guess who's getting the A's? Who's getting in the 90s? The kids who take notes. And know how to write and learned it in the high schools that don't do early adoption of computers in every class. They can have computer labs. That's great. Learn computer skills, but not the interface like Collège de Montréal or I can think of a bunch of schools. That's not a good idea.
We'll start interviews to people here.
I just wanted to respond to the comment, and I know you're not going to like this. I'm a professional nonfiction writer. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you all. This has been really, really interesting. My concern as a professional, as a nonfiction writer, is that the algorithms are learning from writers right now, and then the algorithms are going to learn from algorithmically produced writing at some point. And as a person whose career relies on evaluating information, I fear an apocalyptic future where I have no idea where to turn. You know, facts is a big word, but to turn for reliable information, and I have no idea where it is or what it is anymore. Maybe you want to respond to that. On the other hand, just to respond to the teacher, I also, as a professional writer, and I have this discussion frequently with teacher friends, one of the things that bugged me about my kids going through high school in CEGEP is that they didn't learn to use some of the automatic correction tools that are available and that all writers depend on, you know. And it seems to me, I don't know where it's going to end, but I sort of agree from a nonfiction point of view with what Sean is saying. Like, they've got to learn to use the tools that everybody's going to be learning. They've got to understand the tools that everybody's going to be deploying.
I would
them,
say
you know?
it is a question. It's like, does
Yeah.
one? I think that's an important question. I don't know that I'm sure the answer is like they do,
I don't know
but
either,
I'm like, yeah.
But it's like it's like imagining that they don't have any clue until they're they're let free in the world, and then they have to learn to critically deal with those kinds of things. That disturbs me more than I think kids using GP. I mean, I hear you.
So, I mean,
Yeah. Anyway, so
when in this analogy, when people, you know, I don't know, start giving a glass of wine to their 14-year-old and their friends and inviting them over instead of letting them loose, right? It's like this is the kind of thing, like drink with your parents instead of, you know, the goal is not to get them to go binge drinking. And it's the same thing for at least thoughtful introductions. And I'm talking about a higher level personally, undergraduate, maybe I don't think maybe that 7-year-olds should have screens, I don't know, in the classroom. But when we are introducing in classrooms, or at least I am, it's not, wow, now use this, now stop writing, now stop critically thinking. And in fact, it is used as a conduit to instead do all those things. And they do not go away, I can tell you, like statistically from my students, thinking that I should, you know, write less or less well, far from it. So I also don't think, you know, like fast food didn't kill the chef. And I think, at least for now, it's going to be the case here too. Did you want to add something?
Just Julian, if I'm just going to just jump a really quick response to all that. I think it's okay to do both. Right? I think it's really important to hold both of these ideas in our heads at the same time. It's really about your goals. It's really, what are you trying to do in your classroom, in your workplace, in your family? And all of these things can coexist. We really want our students to learn how to outline, note take, process information, express themselves as individuals. And we also want them to be technologically literate. Right? We want all of these things to be true. And the hardest thing as educators is we just are always asked to do more. There's just more stuff to learn, and it gets harder and harder. But they can coexist. And I think that's what we're all trying to wrestle with, is where are these boundaries? How do we integrate these things productively? Where do we need fences? Right? And I think these are all really great questions, but I think they're not easy to answer is the hard part.
Definition of intelligence to some people is the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time, right? And grapple with that. We'll take this gentleman, then we'll go to two online questions, and then this.
My question is, how far away are we from the day that I walk into a bookstore, pick up a book or a magazine, find something that attracts my attention, but I don't know whether it's written by a machine or a person?
It's happening.
And should I care?
It's already here. If you go on Amazon, you can find, like, there's already tons of books on Amazon that are machine generated that you wouldn't know, that the spammers are already, and including things like foraging guides to mushrooms that include some unfortunately incorrect information about which mushrooms are safe to eat. Yeah.
Okay, the second part is, should I care?
You're going to go with mushrooms?
But in the more general sense of, like, does it matter whether it's produced by human intelligence or artificial?
I want to go online, but to Andrew's point, safety, whether it's the US elections coming up or our elections or picking mushrooms. There was a story of Amazon is selling tour guide books that are AI generated that are completely wrong, right? That just tell you things about Rome or Venice or Montreal that are just wrong. And if you buy them and follow them, you know, you'll miss out. Yeah, AI is often wrong. Question online?
Yep, we have a question here. To what degree do you think, to what degree do you agree or disagree with the idea that writing is thinking?
Writing is thinking. Well, let's ask the writers. Sean, what do you think about, is writing thinking?
I really like, Andrew. I feel like I'm like listening to you tonight, and I'm like, I really like the way your brain works. I really like this kind of like general posture of like accepting multitudes, you know. So I was like, so my answer is writing like thinking? Yes and no. You know, I mean, that's how I feel. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of when I write, I'm like kind of expressing thoughts I have, but there's a lot of other crunchy stuff that goes on that is very unlike just musing. And other times I'm writing so almost I certainly have done writing in my life that is pretty thoughtless.
I mean, I think writing, the action, right, the verb, is a process, not a product. A piece of writing, yeah, sort of the things we were talking about before. Is it the book that we're worried about that got generated, or the act of writing itself? What are we trying to talk about right now when we say writing is thinking? The act, yeah, I guess it is.
And when it comes to nonfiction, there's an interesting theory that all writing or all writers are either architects or gardeners. And so the architect plans things out, as I often do for nonfiction. The gardener especially fiction writers, plant some seeds of characters and plot, and then magic happens. And the best books, I think, are actually both, where there's a bit of planning and then the characters take over. So I don't think writing is only thinking, because then it's pretty boring writing. Second online question, and then we'll go to.
Yep. This one's a little longer. It is not just writing ability, but we're also talking about research and analytical and discernment skills, which may get at least diluted. So while AI continues to triumph, should we keep pushing for the acquisition of these skills along with learning to use AI? Can they coexist?
So I'm not quite sure what the question is. Is it? Anybody? Is it about the AI for?
I mean, should we continue to work with these other even more important skills than working with AI? Yes, we should. Can the two live together? Maybe.
Sometimes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, let's try to get 3 more questions. This gentleman here. Okay, well, actually, we'll have 4. 1,
Thanks.
2, 3, 4 more.
All right.
Maybe.
Same question from 2 sides. AI is not right now writing good capital L literature. I think I've heard that from the floor. I've heard that in the news. I've tried ChatGPT. And that makes sense because it's producing the most probable thing that could come out of your mouth next if you were following an algorithm and using the training data, and good writing is never probable. Should we take comfort from that? Is that a huge hurdle that we should say, oh, you know, we're safe for now? And from the opposite side, if I've got techno joy and I want to read the works of Shakespeare's second lifetime tomorrow afternoon, how do we get over it?
Get the second part. Well, I think I'm still thinking about those travel books that are wrong, and I'm like, I want to take one with me. That seems like a great way to experience somewhere. I love that idea. But I didn't get the second part. You lost your mic. I'm sorry.
Just the same question from the other side. If for some of us, that's going to be very comforting that there are some human things that AI can't do.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are excited to see, how do we teach it to do that? How do we generate a system that does that better?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, maybe I just come back to asking myself or asking ourselves, like, what do I need? You know, and if AI is better at it or can answer that need, then that's great. And if it's a need that AI is very ill suited for, then I don't want it. And people may try and foist it on us. I mean, I think that's where it gets tricky. But you know, I like Sean's point about, look, if it's an amazing story that I want to read, you know, George Saunders said, you know, the writer's only job is to make a reader read the next word. And if I want to keep reading the next words, and it happened to be computer assisted, you know, that's okay. And if it's also the case that engaging with a technology that is very weird. I mean, I think the other thing we haven't talked enough about is AI is weird, right? We often refer to it as alien tech. Someone was talking about, can it justify itself? And it's really fascinating when you ask chatbots to like explain themselves, because they're just, you know, they're like the worst teenager ever, right? They're just like explaining away everything with like moving hands, and you're like, what are you talking about? If you've ever seen the experiment where it played a negotiating game and they started talking to each other in some very unintelligible language, it's fascinating. Like, I just think it's interesting, right? And it's not always going to be human directed. But as I say, we're trying very hard through reinforcement learning to get this technology to sort of serve us, right? To be safe, to be good for humans. But that's not its inclination intrinsically. And so there's that dimension as well, as this kind of alien being and that we've brought into our communities that we have to figure out, how are we going to relate to it? How is it going to relate to itself? So those are sort of the questions that I think about too. I don't know if that's an answer.
Started about 5 minutes late. So are people okay for holding off wine and cheese for 5 more minutes? But we'll keep it up 5 minutes. This woman was next, and then we'll try to take the last 3 or 4 questions.
Thank you. I'm nervous because everyone's a writer and everyone's so articulate. But essentially my question is, in your experience, how much does AI democratize knowledge and written knowledge, I guess, in your experience? Because I come from a family where most people are illiterate. They haven't graduated elementary school, high school, and I was the good student. I read and write, and I can understand this technology and this process. My dad got a hold of Chat GPT the other day, and for the first time I was liberated from having to write his shop signs. And so it gave him the tool, right, to kind of use this language. And he's a very intelligent man, he just doesn't write English. So I'm kind of wondering, in your experience, yeah, how does that, am I just a curious optimist with this AI stuff, or does it actually democratize things for people?
Andrew, you talked about stratification. What's the reverse?
I think that's the hope. I think for an audience like this, professional writers, we're very high up the food chain of writing and competence. And I think sometimes we lose sight of people who really struggle with writing or languages or learning. And so, again, as an educator, I hope that this can be a tool that can really help with that. We have a lot of international students at McGill for whom writing in English is a real challenge. Again, if this is a tool that facilitates that process, it's great. If it's just auto-translate, then they're not really learning how to write in English, right? So I think that usefulness is really a question. But for everyday tasks, for people who can't achieve something, maybe it can substitute and do that. That's great, right? We really shouldn't discount that. How much that happens in reality and who really benefits, I think that's the open question. But we should be open to that for sure.
People there. I mean,
I'm just wondering, what about cookbooks? I mean, with a cookbook, you have to take measures and you have to trial and error and experiment with human experience. Like, can a generative AI work also with unpredictability? Like, if you go for a cup that's more than the recipe, then the souffle won't raise. Can AI work also with unpredictability?
Have you ever tried fighting with Google Maps when it's telling you to go one way? Just turn around and you say, no, this is, so, we're already fighting with AI, and we have to live in that world, right? And I think you have to, not always listen. Just today, there was a story of a family that is suing Google Maps because of a fatal accident that they say Google Maps didn't update what was obvious to everybody about a danger up ahead. So, but at the same time, would anybody here hold a party and tell people you can't come to my house using GPS or Google Maps? We live with it.
I mean, one takeaway for the people here that are writers, professional writers, or aspiring to be, is that there is a lot that goes into writing that isn't writing or even thinking, right? For example, the most recent thing I wrote was a thing 4 days past deadline on Sunday. And I did most of what I was doing was stuff like looking in an old notebook, looking at 70-plus-year-old photos. So, calling up a source. These are parts, I guess, depending on what kind of writing you're doing, that you can hone as skills, as things that right now, the AI isn't an embodied form that can measure flour just yet, but it can probably find out what a normal ratio of flour is in a cookie recipe. If you have skills in your writing that have to do with, I guess, going out in the world and doing something like calling a source, then, those are the skills that won't be replaced yet.
Hi, we were talking earlier about product safety for AI, counting on government regulations to keep things under control. can we really count on them to keep things under control? What's stopping a mad scientist from working in his or her basement to launch some mad AI on the world? In the same way, no one's really controlling replicating Dolly the sheep. We had that 10, 15, 20 years ago. What's stopping a rogue state from launching an AI program on the world?
Yeah, I was going to say I think this is like a really big fear particularly among it seems the AI companies. Like a lot of the fears about artificial general intelligence, so like super intelligence escaping from a lab and possibly nefariously, and they seem to have ideas for high level things that can be done. Someone here just mentioned the computational power. You can kind of keep an eye on where there's a lot of computational, or like restrict access to certain amounts of computational power. But the thing is, I'm a complete Luddite on the issue of like mad scientists, except that what I did reflect at some point, I did realize that you mentioned Dolly the sheep and cloning, or say human cloning, or I think about nuclear weapons proliferation. And it's actually, when I think about it with like an actual cynic's cap on, I realize that the world's done a pretty good job at restricting some of these, surprisingly good. Like if you had told me 50 years ago, like we're going to make it so that only big governments have nuclear stuff, I would say, yeah, good luck with that, you know? But in fact, it's where, and similarly, like we don't have a bunch of, at least not to my knowledge, human cloning projects that have popped up. So it seems like sometimes if the scientific community does constrict certain materials, some of those programs have a history of working. I don't know if they could.
Yeah, I mean, what runs through my mind is when we talk about nuclear proliferation or cloning, there's a certain amount of physical equipment required and expertise, a certain kind of physical expertise to do that.
Whereas if you had enough Nintendos, you might be able to create an AI. Yeah, yeah.
Just, software to me is sort of an invisible thing that's from my limited knowledge.
Just to add one thing, because I know this is really, it is a safety concern that people carry around with them. And one way I try and put it in context is if you think about the immediate dangers of AI, like if you've played with ChatGPT, it'll put into context really what can it do. Is it write some pretty mediocre prose? I don't think is the biggest threat to the world right now. Whereas like we absolutely know that climate change is an immediate pressing threat, right? So we have to also put these things in context of the dangerous technologies, and these I think are very different, comparable things. So I just always try and remind myself, like, oh yeah, no, there's a lot more dangerous stuff out there than some bad prose.
Today, maybe
yeah,
tomorrow.
For sure, I agree.
Very quickly, I'm not a writer. I read not enough, but how do you take the power back, or what? Because it's about what we give value to. So if we give value to learning and to hard work, or if we give value to just go to the easy, tap something and get an answer, how do we take that value back to the tools that are supposed to serve us in the context of a writer, in the context of a consumer, in the context of anybody that has access to everything today?
Sean, maybe you could talk about the value of rights. People like regulation to fight for the right.
Yeah, I mean, you're encouraging me to make a principled stand in favor of the value of writing, but whereas, yeah, because writing matters, according to the banner. But when you were asking your question about how do we take the value back, like the thought that was flashing through my head was we can't. Like, I do think that I believe that once people start using GPSs to navigate, you can educate them about the value of learning to navigate in the world without a computer tool. Like that seems extremely important to have as a skill, and we should educate them about the ways the GPS can lead you astray and so on. But the idea of like, how can we get GPS out of people's hands? Like it's just, I don't know that you can put the toothpaste back in the tube. What we can do is we can educate, like I think educating people on here. So I'm a literary novelist, but I talk all the time with friends of mine who say, I haven't read your book because, you know, I don't read. And I hear lots of people who say, you know, at the end of a day, you know, I'm tired after work or after school, so I don't read. I just chill out. I watch TV, I watch Netflix. And what I try to educate people in my own self-interest is like, no, reading a good book is fun. Like, it's easy. If it's a book you like, a book you like is like really pleasurable and joyous and hopefully nourishing and like lengthens your life and deepens your mind and all these things. And it's really like you have to educate people with these experiences to realize like reading books is fun. And similarly, I think if we do education about critical thinking and about thinking for yourself and writing for yourself and the value of certain expertise as opposed to just a generic machine, you know, with all of its biases that are encoded by whatever data set it was trained on or whatever corporation owns it and all the biases of capitalism and all the rest. I think that form of education can kind of not necessarily put value that's already been lost, but help remind people of the value that's already there.
I think that as much as reading can be really easy and fun, writing a novel will continue to be hard in a good way. And I think when things are rare and complex, they are more and more fetishized and valued. Like, think for a second about the GPS thing, right? Like, I actually think maybe it's okay that somebody in their wants to make certain things that they're writing, like a boring email to their boss, easier, maybe. But I don't think that we're going to value novels being written easier. And sadly, and maybe this is a horrible note to end on, I don't think that's actually what AI is going to do anyways. So it's not going to make certain things or everything easier.
On that positive note, want to thank our panelists, thank the audience Zoom and the audience here. There's wine and cheese, which is free, but we can it's free, but maybe we can take up a small collection so we can buy Sean a smartphone. Okay? Thank you all for coming. Thank the Quebec Writers Federation. Please come up and talk to us here. Thank you, guys. That was great.